The cold in that canyon had teeth. It gnawed through the seams of Corbin's coat, a woolen ghost of a life he'd deserted long ago. The air, thin and sharp as a shard of ice, carried the scent of pine and the deeper, older scent of stone and frozen earth. It was a land that remembered everything and forgave nothing. For a man like Corbin, who wanted only to forget, this was a special kind of damnation. He was splitting wood when he heard it. Not the clean crack of his axe, nor the groan of the pines under the weight of a coming snow. It was a sound that didn't belong, a wet, ragged cough that the wind snatched and tore apart. He froze, axe held high, his breath pluming in the twilight. Air. Loneliness had taught him to parse the language of the wilderness. He knew the cry of the hawk, the snarl of the puma, the low rumble of the bison herds that still, against all odds, haunted the far plains. This sound was human, and it was the sound of dying. His first instinct, a cold and practiced thing, was to go inside, bar the door, and feed the stove until the memory of the sound was burned away. He had come to this forsaken place to be alone, to let the silence scour him clean. But the sound came again, closer this time, a desperate liquid plea that snagged on the thorns of his conscience. He lowered the axe, his knuckles white. Damn it all. Damn the world and every lost soul in it. He moved toward the half-frozen creek that marked the edge of his self-imposed exile. It was a place of grim memory, the water whispering over stones that had, 5 years prior, run dark with a different kind of red. He had been a scout then, for a cavalry unit whose captain saw glory in thunder and smoke. Corbin had seen only waste. There, beside the skeletal remains of a willow, was the source. Not a soldier, not a prospector. A girl, no, not a girl. A young woman, perhaps 16 or 17 winters old, her face smeared with a mixture of dirt and blood. She was Lakota. He knew the intricate beadwork on her worn moccasins, the way her hair was braided with strips of otter fur. She was slumped against the flank of a dead pinto, the horse's body still steaming faintly in the frigid air. An arrow fletched with the feathers of a prairie falcon was buried deep in the horse's neck. The woman, however, had no arrow in her. She was dressed in buckskin leggings and a tunic, but over it she wore a tattered, ill-fitting used cavalry jacket, its blue faded to a bruised purple, the brass buttons dull as dead eyes. Blood, dark and thick, stained the front of it, blossoming from a wound he couldn't see. Her eyes, the color of wet slate, found his. There was no fear in them, only a chilling, bottomless exhaustion, as if she had been running since the world was born and had only just now decided to fall. Corbin's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the vast silent amphitheater of the mountains. To help her was to invite a reckoning. Her people would come looking. They would see a white man, a cabin, and their missing kin. And they would draw a conclusion written in powder and blood. To leave her was to become the very thing he fled, a man who turns his back while the world bleeds. He took a slow step forward. The snow crunched under his boot, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. The woman flinched, a small, involuntary tremor. Her hand, slender and trembling, went to the wound on her chest. "I mean no harm," he said, his voice a rough, unused thing. The words felt foolish, empty against the sheer, screaming reality of her pain. She watched him, her breathing a shallow, painful hiss. He could see the frost beginning to form on the edges of her hair. She would be dead by morning. Another unmarked grave in a land full of them. He knelt, the cold of the snow seeping through the knee of his trousers. "Let me help you." He reached out, his movements slow, deliberate, the way one might approach a wounded wolf. Her eyes tracked his hand, but she didn't pull away. He gently peeled back the edge of the blood-soaked jacket. Beneath it, a crude leather pouch, a medicine bundle, was pressed against her skin. But the wound. It wasn't from a bullet or a knife. It was a ragged, brutal puncture, angry and inflamed around a dark, splintered piece of wood. A shattered rifle stock, maybe, or shrapnel from an exploding wagon. He met her gaze again and saw a flicker of something ancient and unyielding. She was a scout, a warrior. She had fought and lost. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She was lighter than he expected, a bird made of hollow bones and fierce will. As he lifted her, a soft, almost inaudible sigh escaped her lips. Her head fell against his shoulder, and she murmured something. Not to him, to the gray, unforgiving sky, to the spirit of her dead horse, to the ancestors who waited in the cold. It was a name whispered in the Lakota tongue, Hahaka Wambli. Corbin didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was not a plea, it was a summons. He carried her back toward his cabin, his own breath ragged now, each footstep leaving a dark wound in the pristine snow. Above them, a lone hawk carved a silent circle in the sky, a final watchful eye before the long dark night descended. The door of his cabin creaked open, and he stepped inside, bringing the wild, the wounded, and the coming storm into his sanctuary. Of shame, the cabin was a cell built of remorse and pine logs. Every nail Corbin had driven was an act of penance. Every plank he had sung a verse in a long, silent prayer for oblivion. Now that silence was broken. It was filled with the ragged sound of her breathing, a counterpoint to the steady, rhythmic crackle of the fire he'd built up in the stone hearth. He laid her on his own cot, a crude frame of wood and rope that was more about denial than comfort. He was no healer. The only lives he'd ever taken were with a rifle. The only thing he'd ever mended was a broken fence. But his hands, clumsy and calloused from the axe, became strangely gentle as he worked. He cut away the cavalry jacket with his skinning knife, the act feeling like a profanity. He'd worn a coat just like it, had felt its familiar weight on his shoulders as he'd scouted ahead of men who saw this land not as a home, but as an obstacle. He folded the jacket and placed it in the corner, a dark stain of a shared, violent history. With warm water and a clean rag, he began to clean the wound. And then he saw it. Just below her collarbone, seared into her skin, was a brand. It was a simple, brutal design. A letter T surmounted by a broken cross. Thorn, Major Alistair Thorn. A man who believed the only way to tame the frontier was to scar it, to burn his mark onto its flesh, both land and people. Corbin's hands froze. The rag fell from his numb fingers. The air rushed from his lungs, and the cabin, his small haven, suddenly became a suffocating box. The fire roared in his ears, and for a moment he was no longer in his quiet refuge, but back in the chaos of 5 years ago. The smell of burning lodges, the high, thin screams that were swallowed by the crack of carbines, the sight of Thorn on his black stallion, his face alight with a righteous, terrifying fury. Corbin had been his scout. He had led them through the Badlands, his orders to find a path to the gold fields, to avoid the winter encampments of the Lakota. But Thorn, hungry for a name, had his own sources. They'd ridden into the village at dawn. Corbin hadn't fired a shot. He had reined in his horse on the ridge, a statue of horrified disbelief, watching the battle unfold. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. For his inaction, for his silent protest, Thorn had him flogged and left for dead, officially listed as a deserter. Corbin had survived, but the man he was had not. And now here, one of them, one of the children who had escaped the smoke and the chaos, now a woman, bearing Thorn's mark like a slave. 2 ghosts under one roof. He, the ghost of a soldier who failed to act. She, the ghost of a people he had failed to protect. He picked up the rag, his hands shaking. He had to finish. He worked with a desperate focus, his mind a maelstrom of guilt and memory. He cleaned the wound as best he could, pulling out a small, jagged splinter of wood with the tip of his knife. She made no sound, not a whimper, not a cry. Her eyes were open, watching him. But her gaze was distant, fixed on something far beyond the log walls of the cabin. She was staring at the fire, and in the dancing flames, he knew she was seeing her own ghosts. She saw the fire that had consumed her home, her family, her world. Her silence was louder than any accusation. It filled the small space between them. A dense, heavy thing, pressing down on him. He was no rescuer. He was an accomplice, tending a wound his own kind had inflicted. He ground herbs he'd learned about from a settler woman he'd known briefly in another life. A life before the desertion, before the cabin. He made a crude poultice, applying it to the angry flesh. He wrapped her chest with strips of a clean shirt. Throughout it all, she remained unnervingly still, a statue of endurance. Only her eyes moved, following him, judging him. He offered her a cup of water. She looked at it for a long moment before her slender fingers brushed his as she took the tin cup. The touch was like a brand of his own. He retreated to the far side of the small room, sitting on a three-legged stool, and watched her. The storm had come, but it was inside the cabin, a silent, raging tempest of two pasts that had collided in this small, desperate present. He was a man who had run to the end of the world to escape his sins, only to find them waiting for him on his doorstep, bleeding in the snow. And she was the bill, come due at last. The silence in the cabin was not peace. It was the held breath before the lightning strike. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light outside the cabin's single grimy window. The promised snow had come, a thick, smothering blanket that cut them off from the world, enclosing them in a shared, fragile bubble of existence. Inside, a strange, tense rhythm developed. Corbin tended the fire, hunted for what little game stirred in the deep woods, and boiled broth which he would leave by her cot. She, in turn, began to heal. The fever broke on the third day. He awoke, to find her sitting up, her dark eyes clear for the first time. The distant, haunted look was gone, replaced by a sharp, unnerving intelligence. She watched his every move, her silence no longer one of weakness, but of observation. She was a scout, he remembered. She was reading him like he read the land. He never wore the old, moth-eaten cavalry coat he kept for the bitterest cold. Instead, he took the blood-stained blue jacket he had taken from her, carried it outside, into the swirling snow, and buried it deep beneath a snow-laden spruce. He didn't know if it was an act of respect for her, or an attempt to bury a piece of himself. When he came back inside, her eyes were on him, and he had the distinct feeling that she had seen everything. He found her once while he was outside, tracing patterns in the ash and soot on the hearthstone with a delicate finger. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. It was not a map, nor a child's idle drawing. It was a symbol, stark and powerful, an elk's antler intertwined with the wing of an eagle. Hahaka Wambly, the name she had whispered by the fuzz creek, the symbol of a chief, her father, her clan. She heard him, and with a swift, fluid motion, she smeared the ash, erasing the image. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. He tried to speak, to fill the chasm of silence between them. He told her his name was Corbin. He told her about the harshness of the winter, the way the snow could trick a man. He spoke of trivial things, his voice hoarse, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. He was talking to himself, he knew. She never responded. Not with a word, not with a nod. But then, on the evening of the 5th day, something changed. The wind had died down, and the world outside was wrapped in a profound, muffled stillness. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Corbin was cleaning his rifle, the familiar scent of oil and steel a small comfort. She began to hum. It was not a song of healing, nor a lullaby. It was a low, resonant sound, more of a chant than a melody. It was a sound that seemed to pull at the very foundations of the cabin, to call out to the ancient frozen land outside. It was a sound full of mourning, but also full of power. It spoke of generations, of memory etched in stone and spirit. Corbin stopped what he was doing, the oil rag still in his hand. A prickling sensation ran up his spine. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen presence. He looked at her. Her eyes were closed, her head tilted back slightly. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the song was not for him. It wasn't for the fire, or the cabin, or the memory of her own pain. It was for someone listening, someone outside, in the vast silent cold. He looked toward the door, then to the window, now just a black, unblinking square against the night. The fragile peace of their shared shelter was over. The humming was a signal. An arrow loosed into the darkness. An answer was coming. The quiet was not an absence of sound. It was the pause before the thunder. He could feel it in his bones, in the very air he breathed. The dreamlike state of their confinement had shattered, and the ominous patient reality of her world was about to descend upon his. The coming was not with thunder, but with the silence of falling snow. It began just before dawn, in that gray liminal hour when the world is drained of all color. Corbin was awake. He hadn't slept. The woman's humming had ceased hours ago. But the echo of it remained, a vibration in the air. He saw the first one through the frost-crystalled window. A single rider, a silhouette on the ridge opposite his cabin, stark against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky. He was as still as the rock he stood upon, a man who seemed carved from the landscape itself. He was not looking at the cabin. He was simply present, a sentinel. Corbin's blood ran cold. He reached for his rifle, his hand closing around the cool wood and steel, but he didn't lift it. What good would one rifle be? It was a fool's comfort. He moved to the door and peered through a small crack. The world was a canvas of white and gray, and then he saw them. Emerging from the veil of the fog and the trees, silent as ghosts. Not on horseback, but on foot, they did not rush. They did not shout. They simply appeared, their movements fluid and deliberate, their feet making no sound on the deep snow. 10, 20, more. They fanned out, forming a wide, silent crescent around his cabin, their breath misting in the frigid air. Each man held a bow or a long rifle, but held them loosely, at ease. This was not an attack. It was a gathering, a judgment. Finally, a path opened in their center. An old man walked through. He was tall and straight, his face a roadmap of seasons and sorrows. His long gray hair was braided with eagle feathers that stirred faintly in the still air. He walked on foot, a sign of profound gravity. His hand rested on the shoulder of a young boy, no more than 10, who walked beside him with a solemnity that belied his age. The old man's eyes, dark and piercing, fixed on the cabin door. He stopped 50 yards away, his gaze holding the weight of a century. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. The wind died, the creaking pines fell silent. Every sound was swallowed by the immense, powerful presence of the 70 warriors who now stood outside his door. Corbin's heart was a frantic drum in his chest. Each beat a lifetime of regret. He could feel the woman's presence behind him. She was standing now, her breathing calm and even. One of the warriors, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. His voice was not a shout, but it carried across the frozen clearing with absolute clarity, a low rumble that vibrated in Corbin's bones. "You have one of our own." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. The world seemed to pivot on those words. All of Corbin's fears, his shame, his running, had led to the single inevitable moment. He could explain, he could plead. He could tell them he had saved her, tended her wound. But what were his words against the visible truth? A white man, a Lakota woman, a locked cabin, a history of theft and violence, He looked at the rifle in his hand, a weapon of defiance, a tool of fear. He leaned it carefully against the wall. Then he did the only thing that felt true. He unbarred the door and stepped outside, pulling it shut behind him to shield the woman from the biting cold. He stood on his small, crude porch, facing the 70 silent figures and the old chief. He raised his empty hands, palms forward, a gesture of peace, of surrender. The old man's gaze did not waver. It stripped Corbin down to the bone, saw the deserter, the ghost, the man drowning in his past. Corbin took a step down from the porch, his boots sinking into the deep snow. Then another. He walked forward until he was 20 paces from the chief, in the center of the silent semicircle of warriors. He stopped, held their collective gaze for a heart-stopping second, and then he slowly, deliberately, dropped to one knee in the snow. He bowed his head, not in fear of their weapons, but in reverence for their justice. It was not a plea for his life. It was an act of atonement, offered to the land, to the spirits, and to the people he had wronged by his very existence. He had run from his part in their story, and now it had finally claimed him. He knelt in the snow, a sinner in the cathedral of the wilderness, and waited for the verdict. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of judgment, heavy and ancient. Corbin remained on one knee, his head bowed, the cold seeping into him, a final purifying chill. He did not look up. He felt the weight of 70 pairs of eyes, each one a universe of loss and memory. Finally, the old chief spoke. His voice was like the grinding of stones, deep and resonant with authority. "Stand." Corbin rose slowly, his gaze meeting the chief's. There was no hatred in the old man's eyes. There was something far more unnerving, a profound, knowing sorrow. "You carry the stink of the blue coats," the chief said, his words in Lakota, translated by the warrior with the scarred cheek. "But you do not wear their pride." The cabin door opened. The woman stepped out. She was no longer the frail, wounded creature from the creek. She stood tall, wrapped in one of Corbin's rough wool blankets, her expression serene. She walked past Corbin, her bare feet silent on the snow, and stood beside the chief. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is my daughter," the chief sighed, his eyes never leaving Corbin. "Her name is Ista. It means eye. She sees what is and what is to come. She was sent on a scout's journey to watch the movements of a new railroad survey. She was attacked not by them, but by whiskey traders. It was their wagon that exploded." He paused, letting the truth settle. The man who bears the mark of the twisted cross was not there. He meant Thorn. His evil is a different river of poison. "But you swam in that river once." Corbin's throat was dry as dust. "I did," he rasped, his voice raw. "I was a scout for Thorn, at the village on the greasy grass." He didn't offer excuses. He offered only the bare, ugly truth. "I watched from the ridge. I did nothing." The chief, Hahaka Wambly, nodded slowly. "We know," the spirits whisper. The survivors remember a lone soldier on the hill who did not raise his rifle. They remember he was beaten by his own kind and left behind. A ghost. Corbin stared, stunned. They knew. They had always known who he was. Then came the reckoning. It was not a demand for blood, but for something far deeper. "My daughter Ista," the chief continued, his voice softening as he looked at her. She grew weak from her wound. As the fever took her, she was granted a vision by Wake and Tunka. He gestured to the sky. She was shown a cabin of a ghost soldier, a man hollowed out by his own shame. The vision told her that this man, and this man alone, would be the one to pull the splinter from her heart. Not because he was a healer, but because his hands were stained with the same regret that caused her wound. Her journey was not a flight from death. It was a pilgrimage to you. The world tilted under Corbin's feet. The shock of it was more powerful than any blow. This was not chance, not coincidence. It was fate woven by hands he could not comprehend. He had seen himself as a rescuer, a man making a single desperate choice, but he was not the actor. He was merely a stage, a destination. The agency, the power, had been hers all along. She had not stumbled upon him. She had sought him out. A wounded prophetess fulfilling a vision. He looked at her, at Ista. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw not a victim, but a woman of immense, terrifying power. She had chosen him, judged him, tested him, and he had unknowingly passed. She says you buried the soldier's coat, Hihaka Wambly said. She says you cleaned her wound without asking for a reward. She says you spoke to her of your own sorrows, not knowing she understood your tongue. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the chief's lips. She says your silence is honest. He then did something Corbin did not expect. The chief took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The warriors watched, unmoving. The wound you carry is not on your skin, the chief said, his voice now a low, intimate murmur. It is in your spirit. My daughter's vision showed her this. That to heal her, you would have to touch your own pain. Corbin could only stand there, stripped bare before this man and his people. He had come here seeking solitude and found an inescapable connection. He had sought to be nameless and was known in terrifying detail. Hihaka Wambly looked him up and down, his gaze lingering on Corbin's empty hands, his humble cabin, his worn-out clothes. You have given her shelter. You have given her your medicine. You have asked for nothing. This is not the way of the white. Man, we know. He turned to his warriors. We will not take his life, but his old life is now forfeit. The spirits have woven his thread into ours. They did not take him prisoner. They did something far more profound. They claimed him. The test was over, the truth revealed. He was no longer just Corbin, the deserter. He was the ghost soldier of Ista's vision, a man caught in the web of a prophecy he never knew existed. The reckoning was not punishment. It was absorption. They led him from his cabin, not with ropes, but with a presence that was impossible to refuse. He walked in their midst, the snow-covered land of his exile transformed into the heart of their world. They moved through the forest with a silent purpose, arriving as the sun finally crested the mountains at a hidden encampment nestled in a valley Corbin had never known existed. Lodges of buffalo hide stood in a great circle, smoke curling from their peaks in lazy, gray tendrils. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the living scent of the people. It was a world away from the sterile silence of his cabin. In the center of the camp, a great fire was being prepared. Warriors stacked wood with ceremonial precision. Corbin's heart, which had begun to slow, hammered against his ribs once more. He had been spared the quick death of a rifle, but perhaps a slower, more ritualistic end awaited him. A trial by fire. He was brought to stand before the unlit pyre. Hihaka Wambly stood on the other side. The entire village gathered, their faces solemn, watchful. Then he saw her. Ista emerged from the largest of the lodges. She was no longer wearing his blanket. She was dressed in a breathtaking tunic of white doeskin, adorned with intricate quill work that shimmered in the morning light. Her hair was loose, flowing over her shoulders. She was not a scout, not a victim. She was the daughter of a chief, a woman of great spiritual power. She walked toward the fire, her gaze fixed on the pyre. Corbin's blood ran cold. This was a funeral, a sacrifice to appease the spirits for her near death. His mind reeled. He had saved her only to deliver her to this. He took a step forward, an involuntary protest forming on his lips. No. A warrior's hand, firm but not unkind, rested on his arm, holding him in place. Be still, the man whispered in rough English. It is not for death, it is for a name. Corbin stared, uncomprehending. Ista reached the pyre and placed her hand upon the wood. She turned and spoke to her father, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent camp. Hahaka Wambly listened, his expression grave, nodding slowly. When she finished, the chief raised his hands. "My daughter Ista, who was lost, has returned. The spirits guided her. A man, a Wanaki, a ghost, gave her shelter. He bears the scars of our enemies, but does not carry their spirit. He tended her wound as he would his own." He turned his piercing gaze on Corbin. This man came to these lands to be nothing, to be nameless, to be forgotten. But the Waken Tanka does not allow a soul to remain empty for long. A man who lives on the edge of our land must have a name, so we know whether to call him brother or enemy. The chief walked around the pyre and stood before Corbin. He held not a weapon, but a single eagle feather. "You are no longer the ghost soldier. You are no longer Corbin. That man is dead. Today you are given a new life, and with it, a new name. You are not Lakota. You will not hunt with our warriors or dance in our ceremonies, but you will be known. You live in the space between, a guardian of the border between your world and ours. Your atonement is not to die, but to live and to see." Hehaka Wambly dipped the tip of the eagle feather into a small bowl of ash and red ochre, held by the young boy at his side. He reached out and drew a single straight line down the center of Corbin's forehead. A mark of binding, of belonging, of irreversible change. "We will not call you brother or warrior. We will call you what you are. You are the man who came back from the dead to stand watch. You are Tiwanaki, the buffalo ghost." The name settled over him, not as a title, but as a burden. A purpose. It was not a reward. It was a life sentence. A fire was lit, not to consume him, but to forge him anew. Drums began to beat, a slow, powerful heartbeat that resonated with the land itself. Ista walked to him and stopped, her face inches from his. She raised her hand and gently, deliberately, placed it on his cheek. It was not a gesture of love, but of acknowledgement. A seal on the sacred, incomprehensible contract that had just been made. In that moment, he understood. He was not being punished or rewarded. He was being defined. And his life, from that moment on, would never again be his own. Corbin never left the canyon. His cabin, once a hermitage of shame, became an outpost. He was no longer a man in hiding, but a landmark, a fixture in the spiritual geography of the Pahasipa. He did not join the tribe. He did not become one of them. He remained what the name described, a ghost, a guardian of the liminal space. He was Tiwanaki. Years passed like the turning of the seasons. The world outside the canyon churned with progress and violence. Blue-coated soldiers pushed deeper. Treaties were signed and broken, and the great herds of buffalo after which he was named began their long, slow fade into memory. But in his small valley, a strange and sacred peace held. Prospectors who wandered too close would find themselves met by a silent, grim-faced man with a single red line on his forehead, who would simply point the way back out. Soldiers on patrol learned to avoid the canyon, speaking in hushed tones. Of the Indian lover who guarded it with a chilling devotion. He rarely saw Hahaka Wambly, and his interactions with Ista were fleeting and silent. A shared glance across a clearing. The discovery of a bundle of fresh herbs or a piece of smoked venison left on his porch. Their connection was not one of words or romance, but of a shared, momentous past a debt and a prophecy that bound them together more tightly than any vow. He was her living vision, his existence a testament to her power. He aged, the lines on his face deepened, carved by sun and sorrow. His hair turned the color of ash. He became a story whispered by Lakota children around their winter fires, a myth in his own lifetime. The strange white man who lived on the edge of their world, who belonged to no one and yet belonged to them. One evening, as twilight painted the canyon in hues of purple and orange, a young warrior on the cusp of manhood came to his cabin. He was the boy who had stood beside Heihaka Wambly all those years ago, now grown tall and strong. He sat with Corbin by his small fire, sharing the silence for a long time before he finally spoke. "My grandfather, the chief, grows old," the young man said. "He sent me to ask you a question. He wants to know if your burden has been heavy." Corbin looked into the crackling flames, the light dancing in his weary eyes. He thought of the man he had been, the ghost running from his past. He thought of the profound, terrifying moment of kneeling in the snow. He thought of the weight of the name he carried. "It is not a burden," Corbin said, his voice quiet but clear. "It is an anchor. It has kept my spirit from being washed away." The young warrior nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He stood to leave, pausing at the edge of the firelight. "There are men in our tribe who still wonder why the spirits chose you. Why a white man was woven into our story." Corbin looked up at the young warrior, and beyond him, to the vast, star-dusted sky. He had no answer for that. He had only the life he had lived. The young warrior left, and years later, when he himself was an elder, he would be asked about the strange, solitary man who had once lived in the canyon. He would tell the story of the wounded scout, the 70 warriors, and the naming ceremony. And when a child asked what made the buffalo ghost so different from all the other white men who had come to their lands, the elder would fall silent for a moment, remembering the words of his grandfather. Then he would whisper the final truth, the epitaph that was never carved on a stone, but was etched into the memory of the people. He gave what the others never did: time and blood and silence.